On July 8th of 2021, a well-known Dutch artist and designer named Wilfred Steiger finally achieved his lifelong goal of becoming a Guinness Book of World Record holder when he unveiled what's been confirmed to be the world's largest sandcastle. Got a picture I want to share with you, and on the picture you can see members of the 30-person construction crew sitting on one of the porches as a means of demonstrating the massive size of this thing. If you measure it out, it measures to 69 feet, 11 inches tall, which is 10 feet longer than the previous record holder from 2019. If you could somehow zoom in on the picture, and you can do this later on Google, you'd see that this sandcastle is meant to tell the story of the world's ongoing battle with COVID-19. So there are depictions carved into the side of masks and syringes and scenes that depicted what it was like to live in quarantine for all those months, if you remember what that was like in 2020. In an article that appeared in The Guardian magazine, Wilfred Steiger explained the process of how this was built. Took months, as you can imagine. They used over 5,000 tons of sand along with a mixture of clay. And then when all that was done, they put 2 layers of glue on top, hoping to hold everything together. Now, this was built in a very small beach town on the northern coast of Denmark. So the idea was maybe this will hold together long enough to be kind of a mini tourist attraction and will attract crowds to view this and help stimulate the economy in this little town after what had been a couple of rough seasons because of the ongoing battle with COVID. But even with all of that, I want you to listen to the last sentence from the article. Here's what it said. The castle is expected to stand until the heavy frost sets in, probably next February or March. Now, that was in July. Now, one of the things that struck me as I was reading about this is that the competition to build the world's largest sandcastle is actually a little more intense than you would probably assume. It's a record that's been broken 5 times in the last 10 years, and even today, as we said here, there are at least 3 designers that are actively working on their creation that they hope will eventually break this record. But even with all of that, as I was thinking about this, here are these world-famous artists, these world-famous designers, and from one angle, here's what they're doing. They're giving up some of the most productive years of their life, some of the most productive years of their career to build something that in a best-case scenario is going to collapse in on itself in just a few months. And think about that. Say, why wouldn't you build something a little more permanent? I mean, if you're going to give yourself to something, why wouldn't you design something and shape something and sculpt something that's going to stand for decades, if not for centuries? Before you pass judgment on them, though, you need to understand that if we're not careful, we'll wind up doing the same thing. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 12. This morning, we're in week 2 of this series that we're calling Sandcastles. And today we're going to talk about a temptation that all of us struggle with, at least at some level. Obviously, some of us probably struggle more than others, but all of us struggle with this, at least at some level. And that's this struggle of always wanting more. The Bible calls that greed. And what's so scary about it is that it's almost become such a normal part of our everyday lives that we no longer recognize when we've been infected with it, and we no longer recognize its destructive nature. But when you get to Luke 12, Jesus tells a story about a man who, even though he already had everything he needed, became obsessed with the pursuit of more. So as the chapter opens, Jesus and his disciples are slowly working their way toward Jerusalem for what will be the final week of his life. Along the way, as they travel there, they stop at all these little villages, all these little towns, and every time they do, these huge crowds of people show up and they gather around Jesus to hear him teach. And it's in one of those little villages, as Jesus is standing there with this huge crowd of people, that a guy in the crowd speaks up and he asks Jesus what sounds to our ears like a strange question. It seems like it's completely out of place. If you have your Bible open to Luke 12, the question is asked in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, hopefully, you've never experienced anything like this, But if you have, then you know there is nothing worse than a family fight about money, about an inheritance of some sort. And sometimes it's not even money. Sometimes it's just stuff. It's, pots and pans and mama's favorite quilt and, Papa's pocket knife and all this stuff. And people will go nuts about this, and they'll undo an entire lifetime of love and relationships over a small amount of money or over just stuff. And in the first century, we don't know the backstory to this, but in the first century, we do know that religious leaders were often asked to offer opinions. They were sometimes even asked to personally intervene whenever there was a family fight about money. And so as a religious leader, as a rabbi, Jesus doesn't really have any legal authority, but he does have this enormous amount of influence. So it's very possible that had Jesus went to this guy's brother and said, hey, I don't know what you're fighting about, but you need to divide the inheritance with your brother. It's very possible, depending on the guy's relationship with Jesus or his respect for Jesus, that he might have actually done that. But I want you to catch Jesus' response in verse 14. Listen to what he says. Jesus replied, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Now, this is really not part of the sermon, so you don't have to, write this down, but I just wanted to throw this in there. Here's Jesus. He's in this situation, and he's invited to comment on something that probably would have gained him a lot of attention, but instead of giving his opinion, he chooses to say nothing. And the reason I bring that up is because in our world of hot takes and endless social media posts, we have a lot of people who believe that everybody in the world is waiting for them to express their opinion about every single controversial issue that comes along. As if the rest of us are just, sitting at home, holding our breaths, waiting for them to post their opinion on Facebook or on Twitter or on whatever it is they use. If you're like me, there are probably people that you know, people that you love, maybe people you're close to, and you follow them on social media, and they're convinced that they are an expert in everything. Doesn't matter what the topic is, global politics, national politics, local politics, education, military strategy, the legal system, foreign policy, infectious disease, theology, economics, race relations, inflation, unemployment, the banking system. I mean, you could just go on and on and on. And it could be that it's something they've never thought about before. Maybe even something they've never even heard of. But the moment they're confronted, within just a few seconds, they've got it all figured out, and they want to share their wisdom with the rest of us. Can I just tell you, you don't have to do that. In the words of the great philosopher John Wayne, you don't have to attend every fight you're invited to. And if you want to be more like Jesus, you don't have to always express an opinion about every controversial issue that comes along. Sometimes you have to pick your battles, just like Jesus did here. He didn't allow himself to get distracted by getting entangled in something that really had nothing to do with him. Instead, what he does is he seizes an opportunity to talk about something that affected everybody. So you could just imagine, here's this crowd of people, and they hear the question, and everybody leans in to hear what Jesus is going to say. Why? Because people love drama, and what could be more dramatic than a family fight over money? And so Jesus sees his opportunity. Listen to what he says in verse 15. Then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possession. So verse 15 is really kind of the key verse to understanding the whole section. And the Greek word that gets translated into our English word greed is a word that literally means an insatiable desire for more. And in this instance, Jesus uses the example of possessions. And the reason he does that is because in that culture, they didn't have, retirement accounts and savings accounts and bank accounts like we do. And so a person's worth, a person's wealth was measured by their possessions. If you wanted to see how much a person was worth, you looked at what they owned. Now, in our culture, we've got different measuring sticks, and it's very possible that the measuring stick that you use is different than the measuring stick that I use, but we all have something that we look at to measure our net worth. So whatever it is, you could just take out the word possessions and just sort of fill in the blank with whatever it is that you use. So you could say, it might read something like this: watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because life does not consist of an abundance of investments or the number of acres, or life does not consist in an abundance of the value of your IRA, or how many rental properties you own, or how much a percentage of several businesses. You could just sort of fill in the blank, whatever it is that you look at to determine how much you're worth, you just put it right there. And Jesus says that's the thing that you need to be careful of. Because whenever you give in to that insatiable desire for more of whatever it is you put in that blank, you're in a danger zone. And so he says, watch out, be on your guard. And I know that sounds strange because we live in a world in which we're taught the opposite of that. I mean, if you've ever seen the movie Wall Street, which I'm not telling you to watch it, but if you've seen it, Gordon Gekko says, greed is good, and everybody sort of buys into that. But I'm telling you, that's not true, because Jesus said greed is, rather than being a virtue to be embraced, greed is a disease that needs to be avoided. Because what it'll do, it'll cause you to take reckless chances. It'll ruin relationships. And if you're not careful, it would destroy your life. The problem, though, is that like a lot of diseases, it's sometimes hard to know if you've been infected until you get really sick. And so what Jesus does, he follows up verse 15 with a story about a guy that most of us can probably relate to, who'd already been infected with the disease of greed. And as he tells the story, Jesus highlights some symptoms of greed, some ways to know if you've been affected. So just see if you can pick them out, starting in verse 16. And he told them this parable: the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. So if you're keeping track, here's the first symptom that you've been infected with this disease of greed, and that's worry. One of the things that's really important in this story to notice is that as Jesus launches into the story in verse 16, he says that this guy was already wealthy. He calls him a rich man. So this is a guy who's already made his money. His bills are all paid. His retirement accounts are secure. His future is already bright. But then as the story continues, he encounters this problem that's unlike anything he's seen before. And that's that he's got this potential to make more money than he's ever made in the past, because it says his land yielded an abundant harvest. So here's a guy that's already wealthy, and now he's got this opportunity, this potential opportunity to make more money than he knows what to do with. Now, I've had a lot of financial challenges in my life. That's never been one of them. I keep waiting for that rich uncle, you know what I mean, that you never heard of, to just, you get a note in the mail that says, hey, you got more money now, you know what to do. I don't care if it's Jamie's side or mine. I don't care where it comes from. I mean, that would be the challenge that I'm looking for, right? But Jesus said, when you find yourself in that situation, you need to watch out. You need to be on your guard. I told you last week, and there are basically three groups of people that worry about money. Poor people, middle-class people, and rich people. Everybody worries about money. Now, some people hear that, and they want to push back on that, and they'll say things like, hey, when you're poor and you can't pay your bills, there's a lot of stress and anxiety that comes with that, and that is true in your day-to-day life. But what's so interesting is that multiple studies have shown that even as a person's net worth increases, guess what happens? They still worry about money. Their anxiety and stress doesn't go away. All we do is we exchange one set of worries for another set of worries. So instead of worrying about how I'm going to pay the light bill, now I'm worried about how I can double my investment or how I can keep from losing what I already have. So the point is that everybody worries about money. One guy was asked, would you rather be rich and miserable or poor and happy? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, I'd rather be semi-rich and moderately depressed. And that's the way it works for most people. W.H. Vanderbilt was the son and the primary heir of his father, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who died in 1877. Overnight, W.H. Vanderbilt inherited a fortune of over $100 million. That would be, billions in today's money. Then through some shrewd investing, he was able to double his money, and he turned that $100 million into $200 million in just 9 years. Now you hear that, you think, man, that sounds pretty good to me. I mean, please, Lord, that's the thing that we're all looking to happen. But I want you to listen to how he described it just a few weeks before the end of his life. Here's what he told a friend. He said, "The care of 200 million is too great a load. It is enough to kill a man. I have no son with whom I am willing to afflict with this terrible burden. There is no pleasure to be got out of it, no good of any kind." Another great philosopher, P. Diddy, essentially said the same thing. Now you know where all the sinners are sitting right now. They're all on the balcony. No. The more money we come across, the more problems we see. It's true. Here's a second symptom of greed, and that's boasting. Now, in our culture, a lot of talk about a person's preferred pronouns, but you read this story, man, and it's clear this guy's preferred pronoun is I. He says, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns. I will store my surplus. I will say to myself," and it just goes on and like that, because for this guy's perspective, it's all about what he's done in the past, what he wants to do in the present, and this future that he thinks he's building for himself. In other words, it is all about him. And that's what greed does. For most of us, it just takes, man, just the smallest taste of success. And we somehow convince ourselves that we're the ones responsible. And so we start to take credit for things that we had very little to do with. If you look at, there's a great line in this story. It says, "The land yielded an abundant crop." It's an indication that it was God who was working behind the scenes to do for this guy what he could have never done for himself. Now, as you look back over your life, maybe you've achieved some things, maybe you've done some things that you never dreamed were possible, and if you're not careful, you'll begin to take credit for stuff that God actually did on your behalf, that he did for you and through you. Now, here's a third symptom of greed, and that's stockpiling. Now, from one angle, there are a lot of people in our culture who would say that rather than being criticized, this guy should be celebrated because he did what a lot of us are trying to do. He saved cautiously, he spent wisely, he invested his money wisely, and then at the end of that process, he found himself in a position that most of us would love to be in, and that's that he was facing this scenario in which he could make more money than he ever dreamed of making and then retire and live the good life. It's kind of the American dream that a lot of us have been sold, and when you think about it, I mean, that's what a lot of us are shooting for. We want to be comfortable, we want to have this golden opportunity. And so he comes up with this plan. He's going to tear down his current barns. He's going to build bigger barns. He's going to store his surplus grain. Then he's going to kick back on the beach somewhere, and he's going to, eat, drink, and be merry, and, maybe build some sandcastles and whatever it is he likes to do while he's at the beach, kind of HGTV island life. I mean, this is this guy's story. Now, some of you hear that, and you think, that sounds pretty good. I mean, what could possibly be wrong with that? And the answer is that there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It wasn't the guy's plan that was wrong. It was his attitude. Remember, this whole story is focused on a guy who was already wealthy. He was already rich. And so the whole story is focused on what he's going to do with the surplus. What's he going to do with the extra? This is not about how he's going to pay his bills or take care of his family or secure his future. This was all about what he was going to do with what he didn't need to start with. I've got a picture I want to show you. This is R.G. Letourneau. Back in the 1920s, he founded what became the world's largest earth-moving machinery manufacturer. They had plants on 4 different continents, thousands of employees. When World War II broke out, it's estimated that 70% of the earth-moving equipment that was used by the Allied forces was designed and manufactured by Mr. Letourneau's company. When the war was over, they brought those guys home. They continued to produce more equipment, and that's what made the interstate system possible, the highway system, all of that. Most of that earth was moved with machines designed and built by Mr. Letourneau's company. As all of that happens, you can imagine his income continued to climb until it got to a point that Mr. Letourneau decided that he was making too much money. So here's what he decided. He and his wife got together and they started what's called reverse tithing. And they decided that instead of giving away 10% and keeping 90% for themselves, they would give away 90% of his income and live on 10%. Now, obviously, most of us are not in a position to do that, but I want you to listen to how he described this. At the end of his life, he was asked about his philosophy of finances, and here's what he said. He said, I shovel money out, and God shovels it back in, but God has a bigger shovel. And the more he gave away, the more money his company made. In his mind, giving was more important than stockpiling. There's a fourth symptom, and that's security. And what I mean by that is a lot of us have fallen into this trap of trying to secure our futures by means of our wealth. Now, it's not that we want to be rich, but we don't want to be a burden to our kids. We don't want to have to worry about, paying our bills at the end of our life. And so we make plans. And there's a sense in which there's some truth to that. Repeatedly, the Bible talks about the importance of planning for the future and being careful with your stewardships. But there's also a sense, and some of you have experienced this, in which it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank, you never feel truly secure. There's a sense in which once that grabs a hold of you, it's like this insatiable appetite that's never fully and finally satisfied, and you're always chasing just a little bit more. Back in 2018, a filmmaker named Lauren Greenfield released a documentary with the title Generation Wealth. I'm going to show you a picture of the cover. You can get this on Amazon Prime. I think it might also be on Netflix. And it took her 10 years to film all this footage, but here's what she did. She went around and she told the stories with film footage of people who had ruined their lives because of greed. She billed it as a visual history of our growing obsession with wealth. The first story was about a guy who ran a Ponzi scheme, a hedge fund manager, defrauded his investors out of $200 million, wound up on the FBI's most wanted list. He went into hiding for 5 years. They eventually caught up with him, and now he's serving a prison sentence. But that's not most of us. I mean, let's be honest. Most of us are not going to wind up on the FBI's most wanted. At least I hope we don't. But there were some other people in the documentary that were a lot like us. For example, there was a single mom who was a school bus driver who went bankrupt paying for multiple cosmetic surgeries because she read somewhere that as your appearance improves, your income goes up. And so she just kept having one surgery after another. Then there's a story of a contestant on the reality show, Toddlers and Tiaras, who at just 3 years old was asked on camera, what's your primary goal in life? And you know what she said? To make a lot of money. It's kind of a depressing deal if you watch it, but what makes it even worse is that near the end of the film, Lauren Greenfield, the filmmaker, the lady spent 10 years of her life documenting these stories, collecting all the footage. She turns the camera on herself, and she admits in a moment of transparency that in a very real sense, she's fallen into the same trap as the people that she's been filming. For her, it wasn't money and wealth. It was status and recognition. She wanted to be recognized as a great filmmaker, and she was willing to give up everything else to achieve that goal. Time with her children, time with her aging parents, all of that took a back burner to this thing that she was chasing. That's why Jesus said, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because it is a disease that can infect most of us without even us realizing it. So how do you guard against something so insidious and so contagious? There's two ways. First, if you want to guard against greed, you have to give generously. There's no way around it. Now, one of the mistakes it's easy to make, like when we read a story in the Bible, especially a story like this, it's easy to convince yourself that had you been the person in the story, you would have done things differently, right? You would have done things better. So you look at this guy and say, if that was me, I wouldn't do it like that. I would give away all the extra, and I would only keep what I needed. But here's the deal. That's not true. It's just not. And here's how you know it's not true. You don't do that now. And I don't either. Now, some of you are thinking, well, if I had the extra, I don't really have any extra. I don't have any surplus. And in some cases, that might be true, but for most of us, we already have plenty of extra. And here's how you know. If you ever had a yard sale, if you have clothes in your closet that you never wear, if you have clothes in your closet that you've forgotten you own, if you have a garage and it's full of stuff, if you have more than one garage that's full of stuff, if you have a garage that's so full of stuff that you can't get other stuff in your garage. Here's one that's hurt hard in this morning. If you rent a storage unit, if you have more than one storage unit and it's filled with stuff that you don't even know what's in there anymore, then you already have plenty of extra. The only question is, are you trying to build a bigger barn? Or are you trying to rent a bigger barn so that you can store it? Or are you looking for ways to give it away? One writer said it like this: generous giving will break the grip of greed on your life. So whether or not you think you have extra, give and give generously. You've got to give to the point that it forces you to adjust your lifestyle. If you're not willing to give to the point that it impacts your lifestyle, then according to Jesus, you're greedy. If you're consuming to the point of having little or nothing left to give, you're greedy. If you're consuming and saving to the point that there's little or nothing to give, you're greedy. And I know that hurts, man. I know that sounds harsh. But it's true. And then the last thing, in addition to giving generously, you've got to live carefully. When you get to verse 20 of this passage, God throws this guy in the story the ultimate curveball. And he says, I know you think you made all the right moves. I know you think you're building this, this incredibly bright future, and you're going to, kick back and live the good life. But there's something you need to know. All of that is going to be derailed by an unexpected death, and the death is yours. Check out verse 20. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And then he adds this: this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. The Old Testament, the Bible defines a fool as someone who doesn't believe in God. When you get to the New Testament, it expands that definition. It includes not only people who don't believe in God, but people who say they believe in God and then live as if he doesn't exist. And that was the mistake of this guy in the story. Even though he's a successful businessman, he's built an empire, he'd never given any thought to what was going to happen next. And just like a lot of us, he had chosen to focus on the temporary at the expense of the eternal. And so God called him the thing that you're never supposed to call anybody. He calls him a fool. What's the opposite of a fool? It's somebody who lives carefully. It's somebody who not only believes in God, but then lives in such a way that they keep their relationship with him first and foremost in their decision making. So according to Jesus, a wise person is someone who worries about being rich towards God more than they worry about being rich with whatever it is you would put in that blank. Another way to think about it is that a fool is somebody who spends their life entirely focused on building an earthly kingdom, while a wise person is someone who's focused on storing up treasures in heaven. Now, I've got one last picture that I want to show you. Back in July of last year, when Wilfred Steiger and his team unveiled their record-breaking Sandcastle, he was honest in interviews, and he said he knew it was a temporary thing. No matter how good they built it, no matter how carefully they constructed it, they knew that it's only going to last for a short amount of time. At best, it was expected to last just a few months, or as you heard earlier, until the first heavy frost set in, and it would inevitably begin to break apart. But what wound up happening is that part of Denmark experienced an unusually mild winter, so the temperatures were higher than normal, and the Sandcastle, part of it at least, continues to stand. The picture you see on the screen was posted on Instagram on April 22nd of this year, just a few months ago, which is several weeks past the predicted time that this sandcastle would stand. And if you look closely at the picture, though, you'll see that even though the castle continues to stand, at least in some form, it's still in the later stages of decay. All of those beautiful scenes that were carved into the side that depicted all of the stuff about COVID, all of those have been worn off by the wind. All of those porches where people were sitting that were so unique to the design, almost all of them have collapsed. The crown at the top that looked like the model of the virus that all of us have seen now looks like more like a deflated beach ball. And if you zoom in on the pictures, you can see that even the foundation of the castle itself is beginning to crumble. It's beginning to break apart. Now, it took longer than anybody expected, but at the end of the day, it's still going to collapse. And the reason it's going to collapse is because it's made of sand. And so are you. And so am I. And so is all of that stuff that we spend our lives chasing after. It's all sand. I want you to stand with me. As we close today, we're going to sing part of an old song from 1922. And some of you are going to recognize this, may be new to some of you. But as we sing that together, there's several lines in this song. And when you come to the end of each of these lines, I want you to ask yourself a question. So, for example, there's one refrain that says, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. And I want you to ask yourself, every time you sing that, ask yourself, is that true? Because if it's not, I don't want you to sing it. I don't want you to lie in church. So if it's not true, just skip over that. And then you come to that next line. I'd rather have Jesus than to be the king of a vast domain. Is that true? What about this? I'd rather have Jesus than anything. Whatever you put in that blank, I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. Is that true? If it's not, I don't want you to sing it. But if it is, then you need to know there should be some evidence of that. There should be some evidence that you're chasing after some things that are much bigger, much deeper, and much more enduring than the stuff that most of us are chasing after. Jesus said, if you spend your life building sandcastles, if you spend your life chasing after stuff that's essentially going to disintegrate, you're making a foolish mistake. But there is a better way. So as we sing this together, if you need to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, you have questions about what your next step should look like, I'm going to be here. You just come and meet me on this front row, and we'll be glad to talk with you.